So I want to thank everyone for joining us for Why Cities Lose, where we'll be examining how political structures in the US and perhaps even internationally disadvantage urban centers. And I'm here along with my colleagues, Professors Sean Fitzpatrick and Garth Myers. So before we go too much further, I want to thank my colleague, Professor Kevin McMahon, for organizing this event as part of the Trinity Academy for Lifelong Learning series. And I want to thank the participants of the Academy for joining us. Thanks for being here. We're also, of course, so pleased today to have with us Trinity alumni who have been joining a variety of great virtual long walk events and are now joining these events as well. Master's students from our public policy program, current undergraduates, and especially current undergraduates who are participating in Trin Votes, which is our campus effort to make sure that students participate in the 2020 election. So thank you all for being here, and we're really looking forward to engaging with you in the Q&A. So the genesis of this event is the title of a recent book by Stanford professor Jonathan Rodden, Why Cities Lose, the Deep Roots of the Urban and Rural Political Divide. So we know, of course, that today the base of Democrats' electoral power is in cities, while Republicans sort of continually dominate in rural America. And of course, today there's a lot of discussion about issues of gerrymandering, issues of voter suppression, and how those contribute to these patterns. But what Rodden really reveals to us is the historical and institutional roots of the geographic patterns that we continually sort of see played out increasingly strongly. Beyond Rodden's specific findings, Professor McMahon was really interested in this title, Why Cities Lose, because of course, the divide between cities and suburbs and rural areas is an issue in the 2020 presidential election and the election more broadly. So in the wake of protests for racial justice during the summer of 2020, Trump has made claims about urban violence, and he's actively courted suburban women who he expects will be concerned about crime and perhaps declining property values. From my own research on immigration in cities, how cities respond to immigrants and how that shapes social and political incorporation, we know that cities are increasingly in a challenging position, not only at the ballot box, but also when it comes to their own policies. So cities are increasingly a center for progressive policies, whether it's welcoming undocumented immigrants, increasing minimum wages, banning plastic bags, and a number of other progressive policies. But at the state level, these policies end up being preempted or being overruled at the state level. So both at the ballot box and in terms of policy, cities are losing. But of course, we also know that there's kind of an irony in Rodden's title, Why Cities Lose, because cities might be losing in these ways, but in terms of economics and culture, cities are really thriving and they're the center of American culture in many ways, while rural America has been declining. So this economic and cultural divide, of course, is exacerbating these urban-rural political tensions. So to delve into this topic today, we're going to begin with comments from my colleagues, and then we'll transition to Q&A. So please be sort of thinking about your questions. We really want to hear them. We really want to engage with you. And please be prepared to share them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, and I will be sharing the questions that you raise with our panelists. We are going to be using the chat function and not the Q&A section function, so I'll be monitoring the chat, so make sure you put your questions there. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce my colleagues. So first, I'm going to turn to Professor Sean Fitzpatrick, who's professor of the practice in public policy and urban studies at Trinity. Prior to joining Trinity, Sean was director of development services for the city of Hartford under Mayor Bronin, where he championed the revival of Constitution Plaza. He also led the completion of the stadium project at Dunkin' Donuts Park and was part of bringing the professional soccer franchise Hartford Athletic to the city. Sean also previously served in the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey and as a leader and entrepreneur in insurance. And he's an attorney who's previously taught at the University of Connecticut School of Law. So he brings a wealth of experience to these questions. Before I hand the floor over to Sean, I also want to welcome Professor Garth Myers. Garth is the Rather Distinguished Professor of Urban International Studies and Director of the Center for Urban and Global Studies at Trinity, or CUGS as we call it. Garth is a scholar of urban development in sub-Saharan Africa, and more recently, he's applying these lessons to cities more broadly, including the city of Hartford in his book, Rethinking Urbanism, Lessons from Post-Colonialism and the Global South. Garth holds a PhD in geography from U.S.A. With an allied field in urban planning. So I'm gonna turn it over to Sean for about 10 minutes of comments. Garth will talk for about 10 minutes as well, and then we will open it up to all of you for your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Abby. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. In addition to being a professor at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, Professor Rodden, who wrote the book we're talking about today, is the director of something called the Spatial Social Science Lab at Stanford. And that's a big hint that the book focuses on the political implications of the spatial dispersion of voters of different partisan viewpoints in the United States. Rodden's central thesis, as Abby said, is that urban voters who largely hold political and economic views now associated with the Democratic Party are structurally disadvantaged in our electoral system. That is, that they win fewer seats in legislatures and Congress than their popular vote would indicate. Rodden acknowledges that both constitutional structures, such as the state-based apportionment of senators or the Electoral College, as well as partisan gerrymandering, have contributed to this structural bias against urban voters. But his central insight is that urban voters are disadvantaged as a statistical matter by the very fact of their physical concentration in our geographically based, what's called first past the post electoral system. It's worth underscoring that Rodden demonstrates that this concentration disadvantage, if you want to call it that, would exist even in a world of neutrally drawn state legislative and congressional districts. He also demonstrates that continental European democracies that have adopted proportional voting schemes, where legislative seats are apportioned based on proportions of the national vote, as opposed to district by district polling, they've largely escaped this concentration bias problem. In addition, Rodden offers a very interesting analysis of the genesis of today's Democratic coalition in the cities, as well as demonstrating that urban voters in other English common law jurisdictions from Britain to Australia face a very similar disadvantage to the United States. Now, I always get a little nervous when I begin to talk about statistical analysis. I often hold with Mark Twain, who famously attributed to Benjamin Disraeli, probably wrongly, the following adage: there are three kinds of falsehoods: lies, damn lies, and statistics. But Rodden's analysis of voter data and modeling of alternative election scenarios seems pretty compelling, even to a statistically challenged person like me. It also rings true based on our anecdotal observations of recent election outcomes, most famously Donald Trump's victory over Hillary Clinton in 2016, notwithstanding her winning the popular vote by almost 3 million votes. Clinton's plurality was largely based on her carrying the urban American vote by enormous margins. So what are we all to make of this? In my opening comments, I'd like to share two observations and make one suggestion, which we can pick up in the Q&A, I hope. First, I would observe that our constitutional system, for better or worse, was specifically designed to blunt the political impact of large population concentrations in any one locality. It has largely functioned according to plan, with predictable results for the relative power of urban voters. Moreover, this constitutional structure reflected not only a deep concern with any concentrated political faction, but it also reflected a near pathological fear of cities themselves and their perceived effect on the civic virtues that the framers viewed as essential to Republican government. On my first point, we need only refer to James Madison's classic Federalist number 10, which begins, "Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction." Madison made the case in his famous essay for an expansive geographic republic. The primary benefit of a broad spatial dispersion of voters, he believed, was that it would complicate the efforts of any single political faction to gain a national majority. It would thus act as a bulwark against majoritarian tyranny. Now, I want us all to pause and think for a minute. James Madison would likely have viewed Donald Trump's electoral victory over Hillary Clinton's numerical plurality as a vindication of the constitutional system he'd helped design. And this was James Madison, not some democracy-fearing arch-federalist like John Adams or Alexander Hamilton. Which leads me to my second point. Madison's embrace of counter-majoritarian government institutions was not just a dry exercise in political theory. It was inspired in part by a fear of urban population concentrations in and of themselves. There is no greater exemplar of this anti-urban impulse than Madison's mentor and political chief, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote in 1800, quote, "I view great cities as pestilential to the morals, the health, and the liberties of man." And incidentally, it's darkly amusing to note in this time of COVID-19 that Jefferson's comment came in the context of his describing as a silver lining of a recent outbreak of yellow fever that it would, quote, "discourage the growth of great cities in our nation," unquote. And Jefferson's loathing of cities was not just a matter of morals and public health. He viewed cities as dangerous to American democracy. He made this clear in a long letter to Madison written from Paris in December 1787, in which he offered his opinions on the newly minted US Constitution. Jefferson first established his small d democratic bona fides with a sweeping statement that would not have been shared by most of his fellow framers. After all, he wrote, "It is my principle that the will of the majority shall always prevail." 2 sentences later, however, he wrote the following: "I think our governments will remain virtuous for many centuries, as long as they are chiefly agricultural. And this will be as long as there shall be vacant lands in any part of America. When they get piled upon one another in large cities, as in Europe, they will become corrupt, as in Europe." Now this, remember, is the spiritual founder of today's Democratic Party, the most small d democratic political thinker among the founders. I could go on, but suffice to say that our constitutional system reflects both strong anti-majoritarian impulses and an implicit bias against dense concentrations of urban voters. Urban Democrats may decry this state of affairs as it impacts our current elections, but it's akin to the law of gravity in our system as it currently exists. Now, given that background, what's a frustrated urban Democrat to do? Professor Rodden offers some hope at the margins. He suggests some trends that may ameliorate this problem over time, such as ongoing suburbanization, the population movement from super cities like New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco to smaller cities like Austin, Texas, or even Hartford, Connecticut. He also suggests that electoral strategies already being employed by some Democrats, running locally as more conservative than the party's platform, can be helpful. I think we're all aware of Representative Connor Lamb's win in the Pittsburgh suburbs in 2018, where he famously was able to run as a fairly conservative Democrat and win a traditionally Republican district. And finally, Professor Rodden points out that neutrally drawn legislative districts and efforts to combat voter suppression would both be helpful, but he stresses only at the margins because of the statistical concentration disadvantage that he points out. Now, I would say that, it's pretty clear from the book that a shift to proportional representation would be Professor Rodden's preferred policy choice, but he seems less than optimistic that such institutional reforms can be enacted in the United States in the near term, and I think he's right in that. While there are people in the Democratic Party, I would suspect in the progressive wing primarily, who would welcome proportional voting, it's difficult to see a path to enacting it through the political barriers that would be involved. There's an interesting possibility that individual states might try to introduce proportional voting schemes, but one need only imagine the rural-urban political battle that would erupt in a state like New York or California, with both large rural and large urban populations. And in fact, the history of efforts to establish proportional voting, even in US cities, has been very checkered. At last I checked, only Cambridge, Massachusetts and Peoria, Illinois were utilizing proportional voting, and other places like New York City, I believe, enacted it in the 40s and then got rid of it within a decade. So it's a very tough row to hoe against the entrenched interest, even in the Democratic Party, to try to move from first past the post to proportional voting. And therefore, I'm left with a more, what I think is a more practical and achievable reform, which I, recommend to Democratic Party leaders, and that's to emulate Franklin Delano Roosevelt and build a more broad-based national Democratic coalition, albeit not one tainted by the racism of the Southern Democrats that made up FDR's original coalition. I believe that the most direct way to accomplish this would be to build a bridge between urban voters and rural and suburban lower wage workers. But I think I'll pause there and let Garth take a crack, and then maybe we can go back to election strategy in the Q&A.
Thank you, Sean. It was very interesting. So some of you may know this already about me, but I was born and raised in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and that's the place that is likely to decide the 2020 election. And it was in many respects what decided the 2016 election as well, because Trump's margin of victory in Luzerne County, where Wilkes-Barre is found, was larger than his margin of victory in Pennsylvania, which was pretty slim. And I'll come back to that at the very end. What many of you may also know, and what Abby focused on, is that I'm a scholar of urban Africa, not of the urban US. But what strikes me is how American urban politics are coming to parallel circumstances that have persisted in cities across sub-Saharan Africa for about a half century. And especially over the last 30 years, as democratization rose in movements of the early 80s and 90s in Africa, those movements for democracy were overwhelmingly urban, and have examples across the continent, but I've experienced directly in Kenya and Tanzania. This continued in what scholars call the third wave of urban activism, the first wave bringing independence, the second wave in the 80s and 90s bringing multi-party democracies. And this is a 21st century wave that sometimes is called the Black Spring as a parallel to the Arab Spring. It's still going on in many countries: Burkina Faso, Senegal, Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, to name a few. The gist of the situation is that cities become the centers of the political opposition to governments that have their bases in the countryside. This is often severely destabilizing because the seat of government, the home of the state, is in the urban areas, and especially in the capital. This leaves instability because cities are also the heart of national cultures and economic, social, and cultural institutions, colleges and universities, museums, concentrations of workers, headquarters of companies and banks, stock markets. These are all urban institutions. We have occupied streets in Africa next to the centers of power. This is a phenomenon that's been going on for most of my career. And this has meant that cities that I've studied have been in revolutionary tumult. I've seen this in Nairobi in 1982, 1989, 1999, very personally, in Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar in research in 1988, 1995, and more or less ever since, in Lusaka in 2000 and 2005, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, whenever I've been there, Dakar in Senegal in 2012, and now in the US. I see Stan, my friend Stan Marcus is in the audience, and Stan, you can probably elaborate on this much further, but think how much the District of Columbia feels very much like occupied territory, or how Donald Trump won 8% of the vote in Manhattan, the island he prides himself on having seemingly single-handedly transformed. Think about Zuccotti Park, occupied right across the street from Wall Street. And of course, Portland, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Louisville, and on and on. Basically, the only major cities that Trump won in 2016 were Dallas and Oklahoma City. And most cities, he lost overwhelmingly. He lost more than 75% of the vote, in some cities more than 90% of the vote. The feeling of disenfranchisement is very real in US cities. When Trevor Noah made fun of President Trump as the US's first African dictator, it made people laugh. But it's clearly a parallel that I see very clearly in urban studies terms. I've seen African leaders, ostensibly democratically elected ones even, actively discourage and disparage urban areas and urban citizens for decades. Ironically, under colonial rule, as the Ugandan political scientist Mahmoud Mamdani brilliantly showed in his book, Citizens and Subjects, colonial regimes served the citizens, which were whites and elites in urban areas, while the subjects, everybody else, in rural areas and illegal urban townships were subjugated. Post-colonial regimes have worked in a similar manner, even as Africa has urbanized at staggeringly high rates, so that most subjects too now are urban, living alongside the elites. In the US, though, there's some differences, and the biggest difference in this Africanization of urban politics is the suburbs. African cities' outskirts are much different and harder to define in any stereotypical US suburban way. I've spent a good bit of the last 30 years studying these areas in African cities. US suburbs too, though, are changing with what Alan Ehrenhart calls the great inversion. We see rich whites coming back to city centers over the last 20, 25 years, and the working class and Black and brown communities moving to inner ring suburbs. And suburbs are becoming more densely populated, more diverse, and poorer. Big cities in the US remain, like global cities around the world, bifurcated between what my late professor John Friedman famously identified as the citadel and the ghetto. But the ghetto, as it were, is also changing. It's increasingly diverse and global itself. As new immigrants gain citizenship in cities and suburbs become more diverse and mixed, I think the dynamics of the last few elections in the US may shift. We'll see, but if the polling relates to reality, in 15 days, the suburbs will end the Trump era in alliance with blue cities. If that somehow doesn't hold in 2020, and if America in 4 years, after another 4 years of President Trump, remains a democracy, and that is a very serious if, I can't imagine that Trump's sort of coalition would ever hold up again in 2024 with the increasing population of blue cities and the increasingly bluer suburbs taking over. And I'll end with my observations from driving through the neighborhoods of my city in my childhood in Wilkes-Barre in summer of 2016 and summer of 2020. In summer of 2016, on the very streets where I lived until age 17, I saw, in great shock to myself, Trump signs everywhere I looked in a Democratic stronghold. In summer 2020, there were a lot of signs for Republican candidates and very few signs for Trump. And so I think that the Connor Lamb effect that Sean was talking about is very real in other parts of Pennsylvania as well. And it doesn't hurt that Vice President Biden was born and raised in Scranton, right next door. And I have to say, he talks like somebody from Wilkes-Barre to Scranton. The townies of my area are called Hannahs because we're fond, apparently, of mispronouncing the phrase, isn't it, which other people might say, ain't it, by saying henna. And Joe, I don't think has ever said that, but every other phrase I hear from him sounds a lot like somebody of my father's generation in my neighborhoods growing up. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sean and Garth. So I want to thank you both for your comments, and I want to encourage our participants to begin to enter questions in the chat. I have a few questions to start with in my role as moderator, and then I'll begin to go to the chat. So one thing I noticed in your two comments was that Sean was describing this structural disadvantage of cities as fundamental to our constitutional system. In fact, you described it as a law of gravity in our system, which I think clearly there's a lot to be said about that Rodden makes clear in the book. At the same time, Garth offered a slightly different vision, sort of referring to the great inversion and the changes that we're seeing in urban areas and suburbs demographically. And so I just, I actually wanted to go first to Sean and see what you thought of that. Do you think that this law of gravity could change given the demographic trends that Garth has described?
It could. I think, Abby, that the structure as the law of gravity, I don't see changing in the near term. But and Professor Rodden hints at this, and Garth, I think, very eloquently points out that there's a lot going on in terms of population movement. COVID-19 is another wild card in that whole thing. I don't know about you, but a lot of conversation with my students this semester has been about whether or not technology of the kind we're using right now is going to fundamentally change cities forever. Obviously, if that spreads out people of different ethnicities, economic classes, et cetera, then the structure will not necessarily operate to the disadvantage of cities any longer. I mean, but I don't think the structure will change. I just think it's that the concentrations will spread. I don't necessarily think, though, that that's going to be true of a few cities like New York. I think there may be some shifting in population, but a whole other phenomenon that we haven't discussed is this whole idea of super cities, that there are these places that have taken on a momentum all their own. And it's hard for me to see that that's going to change, if only because they are the places, as you know better than I, that draw immigrants as often a first port of arrival for in the country. I think for the foreseeable future, I expect we will see very large concentrations of population in at least a few places. I think that in the same way that there was a lot of talk about the California vote and the Electoral College in 2016, LA and New York City in particular are going to cast, I suspect, an oversized shadow and have to be dealt with in terms of the law of gravity I described for a while, even if we get more dispersion across the board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Garth, did you want to get in on this question, or should we go to a couple of questions that have come in the chat?
I think we could go to the questions in the chat. I agree with what Sean was saying, and I think that I find that the demographics are unpredictable, even when you look at Ehrenholtz's model and various scientific analyses in geography of that great inversion. It's quite nuanced, and there are cities where it's very clear and pronounced, and others where it's not so much. And then the other aspect of demographics besides movement, of course, is in terms of race and ethnicity, and it's a never-ending fascination to me that the city that gets identified for having this wave of urban violence and that the Trump administration wants to take over is the whitest large major city in the United States, which is Portland. And so it's very different than the dynamics that are at work that are supposedly a part of the American carnage that he talked about in his inauguration speech.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. We've had one point of information come in the chat, so I want to start there with our next question, and that is talking a bit more about the concept of proportional representation and what it would mean for cities if we were to move to more of a PR proportional representation system. Sean, why don't I go first to you on that, and then Garth, I'd love to hear about that question sort of in international context a little bit, how some of the places that have more proportional representation systems, how that might affect this issue of the structural disadvantage of concentrated urban places.
Yes, it's a great question because there are as many varieties of proportional voting as there are countries that use it. But in its simplest terms, it speaks of a system where votes are tabulated on a national level and seats in the legislature. And this is almost always in parliamentary democracies, okay? So the head of government ends up being the one whose parliamentary party gets the most votes. And essentially, if the Democratic Party, let's say, I don't remember what her percentage was, but if Hillary Clinton had won 49.2% of the national vote, her party would have gotten 49.2% of the vote of the seats in the legislature. Okay, we don't have that system at all. Now, in some place like New Zealand, which is an interesting place, they have a mixed system where they proportion, I think it's half the seats on a basis like that to parties, and then the other half are geographically based, more akin to ours. And that's an interesting way of doing it, but seems to have had a similar effect to all proportional voting as it's seen in continental Europe. Does that get to the question?
Yes, yes, they were looking for a definition, so that's helpful. Garth, did you want to sort of comment on that at all in international context?
Sure. In the international context, is of course that I know best are in Africa, and Tanzania in particular has a similar kind of mix to what Sean was referring to, where you have geographical constituencies in the parliament or in the Zanzibar House of Representatives, but then you also have proportional seats. And the most fascinating thing about the proportional seats is that they're designated for women. And by law, under the Constitution of Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, several other countries, Mozambique, there's a set number of, or set percentage of the parliament that must be female. And so the proportional seats are given out based on the party outcomes. And you have to achieve a certain percentage, I think it's 5% of the overall national vote to get any of those seats for women. And it changes, the number changes depending on how many women are elected outright, because women can stand for election and be elected. And in the case of Rwanda, I think it's about 70% of the parliament now is female. In Tanzania, it's more like 40. But that really spreads the representation in two different ways, both in terms of having much more proportional representation of the parties than strictly by geographical constituencies, and also diversifying the parliament in terms of gender.
Right. If I could add on that one, Abby, because it's too good a segue. Interestingly, and I'll actually give people a site for this if they're interested. One of the outcomes of the shift in New Zealand to partially proportional voting is that they had the first female premier they'd ever had in 1996, and they've had a lot since, including Jacinda Ardern, who 2 nights ago was overwhelmingly reelected. And there's an academic at American University in Washington named Patricia Lee Sykes, who's written extensively on this. One of her articles is called Gendering Prime Ministerial Leadership in Anglo-American Systems, and you can Google that, or we can put up a post if that'd be helpful. And she essentially shows how the proportional voting empowers voting groups that allow women to break through the glass ceiling in some of these jurisdictions. Not necessarily something you would think of, but there are not just urban voters potentially might benefit from a shift of this sort.
Thank you. Yeah. So it sounds like shifts in this voting system are affecting not only sort of geographical representation, but also who is elected in very interesting ways. But as you said, Sean, this is not something that is likely to happen tomorrow in the United States. All right, we're getting a lot of great questions in the chat, and I want to go to them. I just want to let Bruce and Stan Marcus and Eric Jewett know that and Jonathan Miller know that I've gotten their questions, and I'm going to start to work my way through them. I'll start with an interesting question from Bruce Hauptführer. He says, do you think that it's an inconvenient truth that many of what he calls the worst run cities, like Philadelphia and Baltimore, have been one-party Democratic towns for decades with no accountability? Meanwhile, when New York City took a break from Democrats and elected Giuliani, my chat is jumping around. I've got to scroll back up to it. Here we go. And other Republicans, it apparently flourished, only to resume backsliding with another Democrat. So I think he's looking into what are the effects of one-party Democrat rule on this phenomenon.
I'll hop in. Having been kind of the House conservative in a Democratic mayoral administration in Hartford, albeit as a registered Democrat, it's certainly true, I would say, that anywhere you have one-party rule on either side, it's problematic. Okay, it is very useful to have the push and pull of debate over things, including debate on first principles, when you're trying to run any polity at any level. I think the greatest thing that could happen to Joe Biden if he's elected is that the Republicans hold the Senate, because I think Joe Biden would then actually be able to govern as essentially the centrist moderate that I believe he is. But it's difficult to maintain. I made a joke one time about we ought to reach out to the Republicans in Hartford, and the mayor of Hartford looked at me and said, of which there are 600 in our city of, the two-party system in Hartford now is the Working Families Party and the Democrats. So you do see two-party systems kind of evolving, but they're evolving on the left. And that's not, in my view, that doesn't provide enough push-pull. It's also true that none of, I think, those progressive side parties have grown large enough yet to really compete. If the Working Families Party became 50% of the voters in Hartford, it would be very, very interesting to watch. But I think you would get the same kind of push and pull out of which I believe sort of good policy comes.
Yeah, thanks, Sean.
I would say having lived under a single party state, literally, in Tanzania, I developed the notion, and again, my expertise is far more in cities of Africa, and I feel that the bottom line in terms of legitimacy and popularity in urban politics has to do with the services delivered. And so I wrote a book about garbage collection in Africa, and it's a fundamental belief that if you collect the garbage efficiently and effectively, just one example of the kinds of services that are provided, then your government's going to be popular. And I think most urban governments are undercapacitated. They have very little funding, and they're heavily dependent on the national, state, or the federal government. And this is true in the United States as well. So cities that thrive have to have their own tax base. They have to have their own fiscal autonomy at some level. And that's a difficult challenge, whether you're a Republican or a Democratic mayor. But you have to attract revenue. You have to attract businesses that are going to pay taxes and employ people. And I don't think one party has a stranglehold on those sorts of policies. But I agree with what Sean is saying, that the push and pull and the give and take in any political system strengthens it, because in a single party state, there's no opposition to anything that government does. I was studying a program of highway building and infrastructural construction in Kenya in 2012, and the director of urban planning for the city of Nairobi said to me, the Chinese have built these highways, and that's good because the colonial regime and the independent government after colonialism didn't build these highways. It didn't meet the needs that were clearly there. We needed a ring road around the city. It's a city of 5 million people. We need a ring road. And the Chinese built it, and they built it fast, and they built it cheaply. And then he paused and he said, but they just built. They don't understand that there's going to be opposition. They have no concept that there will be opposition, and that they have to work with constituencies in the communities in which they're building these highways. And I think the advantage of the US, whether the Democrats or Republicans are in charge of the city, is that you always have to do that. You have to work with the local constituencies. And if you don't, then you'll be voted out of office.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, but before we move on to another question, I just want to read a comment from Eric Jewett, who's in the chat, in case people didn't see it. He's sort of referring to a similar situation to what Sean was describing in Hartford in Seattle. So he says, he's speaking about the disenfranchisement of voters of the moderate left in local city elections, where the elected officials, he says, have swung quite far to the left. So in Seattle, the city council, he says, has a socialist, and he says the choice of candidates he's seeing are left or far, far left. So this is a concern being raised by moderate voters within cities. I want to go next to a question from Stan Marcus, who is talking about, is there a sufficiently clear delineation between rural and urban environments geographically to balance rural and urban interests in some preordained way? And the way, where I wanted to sort of take that a little bit was, you were talking a bit about systems that made a priority of ensuring sort of gender balance and things of that sort. Should it be a priority to balance the interests of rural and urban communities in an election system?
It's a really good question. Stan, Sean, do you want to take Stan's question first?
I'm happy to. Let me take a crack. It's a terrific question, and I think that it makes sense to do on two levels. One is simply the level of being a polity that works. The more balance I think we have among large segments of our country, the better we're going to be able to deal collectively with the issues that come up. And I think that's what everyone has been, yearning for in the years coming up to this election. And on a more practical level, I think that if we don't want to have violence in the streets, if we don't want to have gridlock in our legislatures, if we decry the partisanship that has taken over not only our legislatures but our streets, we need to do better in making sure that the voices of people across the spectrum are heard. And currently, I think the way that the polarization has been set up disempowers a lot of people who have more in common than they think. And that's obviously a very old observation, right? But it's even more true now because of the confirmation bias that comes with the internet and cable news and all those things. So that I can't think of a more important effort for our society than trying to balance those things. In the political sphere, yes, but even more broadly, in the social sphere.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to say one thing first, though, which is that when you think of an urban population as being both urban and suburban, as we do statistically in the United States with the metropolitan statistical system, 80% of the population in the United States is considered urban. So if we're balancing it that way, then our system is very far out of whack. That said, a significant portion of that 80%, of course, is suburban and even rural within a metropolitan statistical area, because if you think about just the Hartford metropolitan statistical area, that goes everywhere from the river to the border with Massachusetts. So there's lots of parts of Granby or whatever that are considered to be urban in that U.S. government census scheme, but we all know they're not. But I do think that there's a real fundamental importance to having the voices heard in both rural and urban communities in this country, as seen in Africa, because otherwise you're not the government of the people. You're the government of the urban people of the country, or the government of the rural people of the country. And I've also seen that, and I remember the case of Zimbabwe in 2012, where the president, Robert Mugabe, had just experienced not a setback of what eventually happened of him being overthrown, but in municipal elections, the entire city council of Harare, the capital, voted for the Movement for Democratic Change, the MDC. And so the city council was completely oppositional. And they wanted to have a meeting, like a city council should have a meeting. And Mugabe denied them the right to have a permit, and then they were all arrested. The city council of this capital city was arrested for having an unlawful meeting, which was the city council meeting. And this was perfectly fine with a large number of people in Zimbabwe, because his base is a rural base, and the land reform system had given a lot of people land, and that was what he came to power on the basis of. Who cares what's happening to people in the city? And he did other things along those lines. So I think you have to have, if your base is in the rural area, if your base is in the urban area, you still have to have the balance. Otherwise, you're not governing the whole country, and you're not representing the whole country.
Yeah. A bit ago, Garth, you were talking a little bit about the relationship between these issues and Hartford, as you were sort of referring to the issues of center city as compared to suburbs and what is the city. Jonathan Miller a bit ago raised an interesting question. he has a sort of a broad question. What is Hartford's culture and how has it changed in the 50 years since I was a student at Trinity? But I hoped that both you and Sean could maybe talk a bit about how these issues that Professor Rodden is raising and that we've talked about today, how do they relate to the city of Hartford and its future prospects? How can Hartford win, I guess?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. As the former economic development director for the city of Hartford, I think Sean should take this one first. So.
Well, clearly we used the word regionalism a lot in the mayor's office. And Mayor Bronin has made a concerted effort, including road shows where he's visited town meetings in every one of the surrounding suburbs in Hartford County to make the case for his reform. So when he came up with the first budget that was intended to save Hartford from bankruptcy, which we were ultimately able to do with the help of the state, he literally went out and pitched that budget to the selectmen of all these towns, pretty much the same way he did to the Hartford City Council. And it helped, I will tell you, and I think this was useful to that Mayor Bronin himself he's from Greenwich, Connecticut. He's a suburban Yale graduate. I mean, he's somebody that the people in the suburbs could really relate to. Now, and we always would say that the real test of the kind of reforms we were trying to drive in Hartford would be whether a homegrown mayor would be able to carry them forward with the same kind of support from the suburbs and the state government and stuff that Luke Bronin was able to pull together. I'm very optimistic about that because some of the young leaders in Hartford are terrific. And I think that, forgive me, you may have to pull the hook because this is something I've thought about a lot, but Hartford for a long time, I think somewhat intentionally, Garth had given the example of Washington, DC. There was a sense that Hartford had, I think appropriately, that the state government kind of wanted Hartford to be, kept quiet. And the price of that was the state every so often would have to buy a parking garage or fix the budget somehow, right? Hartford over the since the strong mayor form of government came in, has been trying very, very hard to stand on its own feet. And that sadly sometimes has cut against the willingness of local politicians to reach across the town line. And I understand where it comes from historically, but I also think that it's going to be very, very important for Hartford to think not just as a city, but as the center of a region that has a lot of wealth and could do an awful lot for the city if people, take that viewpoint.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of metropolitan governance, and I think that it's one of the great failings of Connecticut and much of New England. I refer back pretty far back in time to before white settlement in this region in my book, referencing the Abnaki historian Lisa Brooks in her book, which is entitled The Common Pot. And utilizing the Algonquin notion of governance through this river valley, which was actually done by the planners in the city of Hartford in 1970 as well, to look at the long river. That's what Connecticut means, and to see the way in which each village in the Algonquin world was connected to the next village. This was literal through intermarriage, and it was deliberate. And the stronger your connections, the stronger your interdependence was, the stronger you were as a leader, as a songskwa or a sachem, the female and male leaders of the village. And I know that's abstract and that's 400 years ago, but I think it really pertains to what would need to happen for Hartford to win. Is to see itself as a part of a common pot, and to have those suburbs see themselves as a part of that same common pot, and to share resources and to collaborate and build together. And I don't know how, I spoke about these things abstractly and historically because I don't know how practically they could ever come about. But there are ways in which Hartford does share elements of metropolitan governance already, and they work pretty well, like the Metropolitan District. And I think the capacity is there for building that. And that could give more of the fiscal autonomy to Hartford that would, in connection with its neighbors, build a stronger base politically. And then I guess the last thing I would say is that you have a sizable population of Hartford city that doesn't vote, some of whom are immigrants, some of whom are not registered to vote, and some of whom don't bother to vote. And this is especially so in national elections. And I think galvanizing the interest of urban communities to vote and seeing that their votes matter would make an enormous difference.
Yeah, thanks, Garth. We're seeing some interesting back and forth in the chat on this issue. So we have Stan saying that, you know, establishing a metropolitan government in Connecticut is just going to be too difficult because of people outside the city are going to refuse to share in the burdens of the city. Alan, a little bit earlier, was talking about rural voters outside of New York City and their frustration historically about subsidizing the city. I, as a relatively new Hartford resident, about 8 years ago arriving here, was so fascinated to find that the city of Hartford is 17 to 18 square miles. So it's very, very, very small. And yet it holds so much of our local cultural wealth, our businesses and all of that, so many people commuting into the city. And it holds all these state buildings and colleges like our dear Trinity that don't pay taxes. That make it so challenging for the city to support a tax base. So while there is that tension between the suburban voters feeling as though they're subsidizing and not wanting to, in the case of Hartford, it seems that that's something that's almost essential if we want to have a city to commute into and to enjoy the cultural wealth of.
Right. I would, and by the way, Abby, that was like the perfect description of the tax bind that the city of Hartford is in, which is absolutely true. I would say something again on the hopeful side, which is that I've always been pleasantly surprised by how invested a lot of people in the local suburbs around here are in Hartford being successful. They're frustrated when they see those efforts go down rabbit holes of poor management like Dunkin' Donuts Park before we rescued it, et cetera. But when they believe that the government in Hartford is acting ethically and efficiently, suburban support does go substantially up. I would also say that just practically, and we're getting a little in the weeds, but one of the things that the suburbs in Connecticut drown under is the cost of things like special education mandates. Okay, and there have been experiments through CREC and other organizations in beginning to break down some of those barriers in ways that benefit the suburbs financially as well as the city. And I think if people took a look at those things and didn't start with, we need one big school system for the whole region, which is of course the third rail. But there are ways to get closer to that I think would be embraced once the trust is established among the political communities that they're all coming to the table with honesty and good financial management.
Thanks. We're getting down to the last couple of seconds. I just wanted to, I'm going to raise a last question, but I did also want to just acknowledge Curtis Nelson had a very interesting observation in the chat saying, is the influence of the idealized pastoral lifestyle something you would describe as inherent to the classic republic, thinking Rome and Virgil's politicization of the differences of urban and rural lifestyles? Is this a real difference or one that's only idealized for political purposes? So this gets back a little bit.
I love that question.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Do you want to say a few words? We're finishing up, but I think we could take a little time if you want to comment on it.
I'm going to use an anecdote to comment on it, which is that's a question I ask myself a lot. I have a group of first years in a seminar called Reading the City this year, which is trying to look at the city through the lens of every liberal art I could put in there. And it is clear to me that, and these are largely suburban kids, not surprisingly, coming to Trinity, that there is something about the suburbs which is viscerally good to them. Okay, and that they're fascinated by the city, a little frightened of it, and they think they want to live in a city. But when they talk, they literally use phrases like the American dream a lot, and not in an insincere way or a, you know, they have convinced me that that idea of the little lawn and the house and the dog and everything is more powerful in the millennial generation or whatever their generation is than I thought it was, quite honestly.
I'll leave it for you, Abby, because I have stuff to say, but I know we're running out of time. So
okay, all right. So yeah, interesting questions about these idealized versions of both both the rural and the urban, I think, these days. So I think, you know, this leaves us with the big question that Rodden raises and that Sean raised, which is, what is the urban Democrat to do? I only have like 30 seconds to say at the end. So could I let you each in here for about, you know, 1 minute? What do you think is the top thing that the urban Democrat should do about this issue of cities losing?
well, I see Stan told me I should go back to Wilkes-Barre.
Yeah, I saw that.
Thank you, Stan. But I do think that urban Democrats need to build alliances with the suburbs and rural areas, and especially in a small state like Connecticut. My brother lives in Canton, and it's, you know, as he says, it's an hour to any place in Connecticut from where we are in the center. Maybe it's an hour and 15 minutes if the roads are slow or whatever, but it's a small state. And you know, by some vision in urban studies, you could consider all of Connecticut as an urban setting, as a part of Bosnia-Wash, whatever you want to call the megalopolis between Boston and Washington, or between Portland, Maine and Virginia Beach or something. And so, you know, I think seeing the common ground and building on that and political alliances is crucial.
Yeah, thanks. Garth, do you want to get in there with one thing?
Yeah,
sorry,
Abby, and I just building on that point, I think Donald Trump won in 2016 because the Democrats had tried to appeal through the lens of what's called intersectionality to a large portion of the population. And if they had appealed to the same people through the lens of economic inequality and entrenched disadvantage, they would have picked up what I call the J.D. Vance vote, which I believe is why Trump is president. And I think that as much as we can all acknowledge that there are legitimate issues that go into, you know, to use that word, intersectionality, but which is so easily tagged as identity politics by the Democrats' opponents, I believe it has to be something that has a broader economic appeal to more people across the urban, suburban, rural divide. And I think that's honestly right there, you know, for Scranton Joe Biden, if he'll seize it.
Yeah. For further reading on this topic, I really encourage people to pick up Kathy Kramer's book, The Politics of Resentment, which talks about, you mentioned identity politics, but that term is, I think, maybe should be defined differently these days. And she talks about the increasing rural consciousness and white rural American identity, which is a dominant force, as we see in this book and more broadly in the election that's coming up. I want to thank you both so much for this really engaging conversation. I want to thank our attendees for participating. And I want to invite you all to attend the next 2 events of the Academy of Lifelong Learning Presidential Politics series. Thursday at 1:10 p.m., this Thursday coming up, we have Pandemics, Polarization, and Presidential Politics with Professor Rachel Moskowitz and Professor Kevin McMahon. And then next week, Wednesday the 28th at 5 p.m., we have Red State, Blue State with, again, Professor McMahon, who's organizing this series, as well as Pearson Cross from the University of Louisiana and Randall Adkins from the University of Nebraska to talk about the political situation on the ground in more Republican red states. So the flip side of this conversation. So I encourage you to go to those registration links, and we really look forward to continuing to engage with this audience through the Academy of Lifelong Learning and through other venues. So thanks everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Abby.